Does it work? Yes. Perfect.
So good afternoon and welcome to the afternoon session of today. And the next speaker is Peter Van Toor, and the title is Partimento Reinvigorated, Unpacking its Impact in the Digital Age. There hardly need to introduce Peter Van Toor. He's one of the first heroes of Partimento. And but he's a scholar with a background spanning multiple disciplines. He has master's degree in music pedagogy, musicology, and music theory. As a co-founder of the Gotland School of Music Composition in Wisby, he has played a pivotal role in nurturing the talent of aspiring composers. Following the completion of his PhD dissertation, Counterpoint and Partimento, in 2015, I think it was in Uppsala, yeah. Peter embarked on a journey as an educator, serving as a guest professor at the Catholic University in Leuven in 2016, and an associate professor in music theory at the Norwegian Academy of Music in Oslo between 2017 and 2020. Currently, Peter serves as an associate professor in music theory and analysis at the Örebro University in Sweden. Peter's academic output ranges from analytical studies to compositional theory, paleographic studies, and music theory pedagogy. Thank you. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. So thank you. So I will, for the first time in my life, have a paper I read, actually. I've never done that. So that will be exciting. First of all, a word of thanks to the organizing committee for inviting me and for the fantastic organization here. I hope you all sense the appreciation we all have for these efforts. Okay. As many of you may know, much of my previous work has been focused mainly on examining all kinds of manuscripts. So solfeggio manuscripts, Partimento manuscripts, counterpoint notebooks, but also scores of masses, dixits, and also student compositions related to the Neapolitan conservatories in the late 18th century. Since some 4 or 5 years ago, I've been gradually shifting my focus to Bologna and to Giambattista Martini. This keynote lecture will not be about manuscripts or handwritings. Instead, I want to take the opportunity to zoom out quite a bit from the manuscripts themselves, but also from 18th century Naples in general, or even Italy, and to take a wider view upon our field of study, introspectively and retrospectively. I think it's fair to say that what is sometimes referred as the Partimento revival, some would argue that it would be more accurate to be defined as the thorough bass revival, represents a kind of paradigm shift in music theory and its pedagogy. Regardless of what we choose to call these developments today, it seems clear that this renewed interest in thorough bass has triggered a re-engagement with practically oriented music theory, complementing more traditional reproductive and analytical skills with skills such as composing at the keyboard, analyzing at the keyboard, vocal improvisation, embellishing reprises, or even composition in 18th century styles. There have been such tendencies before, but the shift we've seen over the past few decades appears to be more profound than what we've seen for some 150 years or so. So this lecture will take a wider view on this shift in attitude regarding the practical side of music theory. I will start with the changes that I've seen happening around me during my own lifetime, and I will sketch developments as I experience them. To better understand these developments, I will also reflect a little bit more about the period where the exact opposite took place, that is, the period when improvisation declined. And I've chosen to specifically look at some accounts from the period between 1820 and 1840. Well, to avoid preaching to the choir, I hope to confront you with some skepticism from the early 19th century, and thus of some rather critical views on the use of thorough bass as a method for teaching harmony and composition. The central question for this lecture is thus, what are the underlying reasons for these shifts? In addition to this, the epilogue of this lecture will hold a few ideas for future research in Partimento-related issues or studies, and the educational context around these kinds of materials. So, my own journey, let me begin where it all started for me personally. My own engagement in improvisatory learning in music theory started growing quite some time ago. It was in the late 1980s, during my studies in musicology at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, that I became fascinated in improvisational techniques in 16th century counterpoint. I spent most of my spare time reading Tinctoris, Gafurius, Zarlino and several others, and tried to understand ways of learning counterpoint as it was done before Johann Joseph Fuchs. My professor in Renaissance music at the University in Utrecht, Willem Elders, urged me to apply for a PhD on the topic. Actually, he had already come up with a title for my dissertation and thought it should be called Homo Ludens, obviously referring to the famous book by Johan Huizinga, the Dutch historian and cultural theorist. Well, I had other things in mind. I moved to Gotland in Sweden, and there, together with the Swedish composer Sven David Sandström, I founded a school for young composers called the Gotland School of Music Composition, where I taught historical writing techniques. I share these memories from my own past with you, not only as a way to present myself, but also because I believe that they tell a story about the period in which I grew up. They illustrate, I think, some shifts in attitude that were characteristic for the 1980s and 1990s. The institution at which I was educated in Utrecht was still primarily a center for research in historical musicology. I remember that about half of the courses that were offered there ended with two words: performance practice. There were courses such as medieval performance practice, Renaissance performance practice, 16th century performance practice, 17th century performance practice. And I actually took all these courses. Now, this is a long time ago. I don't know any university in Sweden or in Scandinavia or elsewhere where this kind of curriculum is still offered today. And I don't think there's much left of it in Utrecht either. Much has happened. When I had breakfast the other day with my friend Nicholas Baragwanath in connection with another conference last week, he told me that historical musicology at Nottingham University now would be represented by just one university course called Music from the Past. He laughed cheerfully, although understandably with a slightly forced smile. As you know, the 1980s represented a decade in which the CD market, especially for classical music, exploded. Universities at the time were eager to respond to these new developments. I remember at the end of the 1980s, there was much talk going on in Utrecht, not only should performance practice be at the forefront of studies in musicology, but also the pedagogical contexts in which the music was composed, produced, or staged. At that time, I think my generation became increasingly aware that not only questions regarding notation, ornaments, the history of instrument building, authentic fingerings, or the quest for an authentic sound, whatever that was, were of importance, but also how music was learned and taught in distant periods of our music history. So one of the things I focused on myself was the fact that the 15th century singer in, let's say, a Renaissance chapel in northern Italy, in most cases, not only was a singer, but often also a lute player, an organist, an improviser, and in many cases also a composer. In retrospect, it has struck me that the dissertation that I ended up writing 25 years later in Uppsala, called Counterpoint and Partimento, was almost a kind of 18th century equivalent to the initial PhD project that was proposed to me by Willem Elders. As it were, a kind of 18th century Homo Ludens. Looking back at the decades that have passed and at the shift in attitude towards improvisation, I sometimes wonder whether these developments have had any real or broader effect on large groups of students, or on the general quality of the music theory education we offer in our conservatories and universities. Well, perhaps not as much as we might have hoped for. My impression is that these developments grow more easily outside of the old institutions, such as on new digital platforms, than in them. Now, I run the risk of slightly overstating this, of course. I do know that that some progress has been made, for example, in the realm of textbooks. Things that immediately come to mind are textbooks such as Peter Schubert's Modal Counterpoint, Barnabé Janin's Chanter sur les livres, Johannes Menke's books on Renaissance and Baroque counterpoint, and of course Marco Schwenkrei's fantastic compilation Compendium Improvisation. Likewise, in the subject of harmony, similar developments can be seen in Job IJzerman's Harmony Counterpoint Partimento, a new method inspired by old masters. And I know that there is much experimentation going on with integrating more historically informed methods, pedagogy in counterpoint and harmony classes by using computers, for example, as well as in other subjects such as musicianship or classes in ear training or solfège. As you may hear from my accounts, that it actually it's a bit difficult to sketch the state of affairs for a subject of music theory and its development. In some respects, the development of our subject appears to be a complete disaster, while there are other aspects that may look quite hopeful and positive at the same time. I hear many teachers in what I call the old institutions lament not only the limited effectiveness of their teaching, but also the logistics, the growing and worrying number of students per group, recurring budget cuts, and perhaps most damaging of all, the decreasing amount of time allocated for subjects such as harmony, counterpoint, or performance practice. But there are, luckily enough, also positive developments that counterbalance the problems we are facing. First and foremost, we have the area of technical innovations. A lot is actually happening. I started already mentioning the influence of the CD in the 1980s and how this affected musicology back in those days. But actually, a whole storm of technical innovations have followed, and we are still in the eye of that storm, I would say. It may here suffice to raise just one of these innovations, the World Wide Web. The 1990s saw its first large-scale introduction, and already around the year 2005, web pages such as Facebook and YouTube started to affect practically every aspect of human activity. It's no coincidence, I think, that the same year in which Facebook and YouTube really exploded, 2007, is the same year that Robert Gjerdingen's Music in the Galant Style was published. Well, let me remind you of the full title of this pivotal publication, as it is given in graphic form on its front cover. It's a little bit difficult to read on the flap, but I put it aside as well. Music in the Galant Style, being an essay on various schemata characteristic of 18th century music for courtly chambers, chapels, and theatres, including tasteful passages of music drawn from most excellent chapel masters in the employ of noble and noteworthy personages, said music all collected for the reader's delectation on the World Wide Web. And you are already getting my point. This entire shift in attitude towards a more practically oriented music theory has everything to do with the large-scale introduction of the internet. Okay, as it is described in modern cultural history, history is often seen as most intriguing during times of change, centering on specific turning points, on moments when societies experience profound shifts in values, ideologies, and other types of value-based structures. When we consider the history of improvisation, such a turning point is found in the early 19th century, and perhaps at its clearest between 1820 and 1840. Such changes are sometimes called history's rhythm. Each era invites its counter-era, only for the pendulum to inevitably return to its previous place. So what happened roughly between 1820 and 1840? A first point that can be noted during this period is the fact that thorough bass became increasingly downplayed, even neglected in teaching. We hear negative attitudes such as that thorough bass was too much about harmonic formulas and too little about what was really important in music composition, melody. One of the most important German writers on composition in the mid-19th century, Adolf Bernhard Marx, remember he wrote this huge 4-volume treatise on composition called Die Lehre der musikalischen Komposition, praktisch-theoretisch, books that Arnold Schoenberg owned and thoroughly studied. This Marx reports in the second volume of his autobiography, called Erinnerungen meines Lebens, published in Berlin in 1865, how he felt about teaching thorough bass. This was happening in the early 1830s. Okay, I will project the original German text for you here on the PowerPoint. but I will read my translation in English. Ludwig Berger, the first piano teacher in Berlin, widely admired for his insightful compositions and for his passionate songs, sent me several young ladies, one after the other, to instruct them in thorough bass. At that time, and as I said, we're talking here about the 1830s, it was still believed that this would lead to a deeper understanding of our art. I provided each of these young ladies with the usual lessons in thorough bass. One day, a Miss Romberg, also sent to me by Berger, expressed her wish to study thorough bass. She was one of those striking beauties whose intellectual depth remained hidden behind her external charm. I introduced her to the basic concepts of chords and inversions, along with the mysteries of thorough bass figures. However, when she pressed a roll of coins into my hand at the end of the first month, I felt as though I would sink into the ground. It felt as if I had been unmasked, caught like a thief. Here stood a noble, beautiful, and trusting soul, seeking spiritual nourishment through the bread of composition, yet all I could offer was a lifeless stone. What was she truly searching for? She longed for a glimpse into the hidden mechanics of our art, an experience of awe, and perhaps even an understanding of how moving sounds could take shape in the human spirit. But could that dusty relic of thorough bass really provide this? And had thorough bass really deepened my understanding, or rather left me confused and paralyzed? It took me a long night of struggle before I could see more clearly what to do. The paths of life, the melodies of one or more voices, how they unite in blissful harmony or resist and clash against one another in the turmoil of earthly existence, what I had perceived and contemplated as my own guide in the realm of sound, that only could truly benefit her. I had to give her that, or escape from her nobly questioning gaze like a thief. The night decided, it carried the seed of Die Lehre von der musikalischen Komposition within it. Okay, so the foreword of this first volume of this treatise that Marx started to write after this episode, and that was published in 1837, gives us some hints of what Marx envisioned and what aspects were lacking in his lessons in thorough bass. Let's hear. From the beloved scores, an increasingly recognizable and conscious unified spirit seemed to emerge. One that is the same through all art, that allows the idea of art itself to take shape, and that enables the conception of the particular artwork. Just as the active soul shapes its future body within the womb, so too is the form of the artwork called forth in every detail, emerging through the artist's loving and fervent inspiration, either as investigation and personal awareness convinced me there is a spiritual content throughout art, or everything else is mere mechanism and play of the senses, or else the spirit conditions and permeates the whole as a unified living organism, just as the soul animates all the parts of a person. An art theory that does not start from this foundational essence of art, that cannot draw everything without exception from it, referring everything back to it, an art theory that separates content and form, like spirit from corpse, creation and mechanism. Teachable parts, such as harmony and counterpoint, from unteachable ones, melody and shaping. That would dare to to relinquish the inner unity and necessary completeness of itself. Such a theory would not have fulfilled its purpose, however praiseworthy and indispensable it might have been as a preparatory work. So what was lacking according to Marx's understanding of the matter in Thoroughbase? I would say, if I paraphrase him, that he wanted his teaching to be about composition, about melody, and about art, rather than what he called the mechanics of music. And what about improvisation, or fantasieren, as the Germans prefer to call it? Let's listen to another German author, Johann Daniel Anders. Anders gives us the following definition in his 1829 publication Musikalisches Wörterbuch für Freunde und Schüler. That is on the word fantasieren. He says this: to express one's feelings on an instrument from any desired theme as the imagination directs them in the moment, without regard to a specific type of performance, and, listen here, without necessarily following the rules of composition. Now, make no mistake, this is a dictionary. Yeah? So what we can see here is that there is a general consensus that improvisation not necessarily follow the rules of composition. Beethoven's pupil Carl Czerny started his 10th and last letter about piano playing with something similar. Such improvisations naturally cannot and should not have the strict form of a written composition. And also, you will find that almost all forms commonly used in composition can be used in improvisation as well. One can improvise variations on a self-chosen or even on a theme proposed by someone else. It is possible to create very interesting potpourris from several beloved motifs and to connect them into a brilliant piece through dazzling passages. Well, you hear already the warning bells about improvisation ringing here. In more improvised styles, there is a clear risk of superficiality, of situations where listeners experience a lack of coherence, or situations where music making has turned into a kind of circus act. It is easy to find negative accounts of improvisation in concert reviews too, in forewords to publications, etc. I won't bore you with too many of these, but I hope you will allow me to read at least one here at the end. The following account describes the artistic output of Ferdinand Ries, the famous pianist from Berlin, who was actively performing in Germany in the 1820s and 1830s. Ries became particularly known for playing and improvising potpourris, mostly over themes by Rossini and other opera composers. In the German magazine Didaskalia oder Blätter für Geist, Gemüt und Publizität, his work is described in some detail in the issue of Saturday, the 9th of December, 1829. Our reviewer tells the story of Ries playing a concert in front of a few hundred listeners, in which the last piece of his program was an improvised fantasy, in which, and this is interesting, the musical themes that had been part of the concert were expected to reappear in the improvisation. In his text, this reviewer quoted another critic who had problematized Ries's double-sided nature of producing a lot of superficial music, such as potpourris and fantasies, but is also clear about Ries's capacity as a very good composer. This is what he says. A most competent art critic judged the composer in the following way. Ries's compositions must first of all be classified, for there is no one as two-faced, one might say double-tongued, as Mr. Ries as an artist. As Mr. Ries is as an artist. Those who examine most of his recent compositions, especially his so-called Fantasien and potpourris, of Rossini and other embellished matters must see him as one of those fashionable, talented men, perhaps with more pianistic routine than some others, essentially the musical lackey of the most modern and watered-down trends. Pleasant but entirely characterless melodies, modern, most of them heard 100 times, rarely any new figures, a certain richness that is not achieved through strong and rich modulation, but rather through arpeggiations of chords, a loose, often very loose, and incoherent style, yet everywhere a treatment that shows great knowledge of the fortepiano. These were the features one could use to characterize these compositions, from which the above judgments about the composer must be abstracted. Still, how astonishing is it not to encounter some of this composer's earlier works? For example, the magnificent quartet in E-flat major. Works that are original, grand, full of fire, full of passion, possessing the most splendid and unified expression, where every melody and every figure is both beautiful and characterful, everywhere displaying strong, often new and striking modulation, true masterpieces. This is a richly gifted, thoroughly educated artist, one of our most esteemed composers, an indispensable teacher for anyone seeking a complete education in the fortepiano. Does he perhaps have two souls in his body, like the two bodies of the Platonic lovers, sharing one soul? The loose style, of course, is the improvised style of Ries, while the early compositions that are depicted here are the composed artworks. Now, it would be too easy to assume that those parameters that once drove us away from improvisation would be the same parameters that are now pushing us back into improvisation. Things are, of course, more complicated than that. I do believe, however, that what we have seen happening in the past few decades is actually a reaction to the general state of affairs in music theory and its pedagogy. Augusta Campagni posed the question already in her introductory lecture, why is this all happening right now? I return to the same question, although I have maybe slightly different answers. So the first thing I would say is desire to learn practically. There is no doubt that music students and teachers are trying to find learning approaches today that foster not only analytical understanding, but also embodied skills. Secondly, shift towards creative skills in music theory education. There's a growing recognition that traditional music theory, as often taught, mostly focusing on written analysis and tasks, falls short of really developing active musicianship. Partimento aligns well with the goals of training well-rounded musicians who can not only analyze and reproduce, but also improvise and produce. Thirdly, increased interest in historically informed performance practice. The historical performance movement has opened the path for integrating music theory, history, and practice in a way that seeks to understand music from the composer's perspective. I think this is also an explanation. Then we have digital access to historical sources. Also not something that we didn't see like 20 years ago. What a revolution for higher music education, I would say. Not only are Partimento manuscripts becoming available on the web, but autographs of the work of many composers, treatises. And finally, practical learning is amplified in the digital age. Ironically, while modern digital tools have transformed music making, they have also highlighted the value of internalized skills that are less dependent on technology. What I mean by this is that Partimento's hands-on, memory-based approach in a way has come to function as a counterbalance to the screen-dependent, plug-and-play and copy-and-paste tendencies in today's music production. Now, in this last part of my lecture, I would like to give a quick overview over our new landscape of improvisation and of Partimento-related publications. So let's begin with the starting point I already mentioned. I would here choose Robert Yardigan's books. His two books are the most eloquent musicological books that I know, and I have learned so much from them. Yeah, this was happening. These two publications came 2007. The Journal of Music Theory had a special issue about Partimento, which was very, very important. And then we had Music of the Galant Style in the same year. I already mentioned Peter Schubert's very important work, and I added another very important work about Renaissance improvisation by Philippe Canguillan, based on the treatises of Lusitano. If you don't know these books, they are really, really important for research on improvisation. Then, of course, a very important book, The Art of Partimento, 2013, Giorgio Sanguinetti's The Art of Partimento. And slightly later, 2017, the result of the Venice conference that was taking place in 2013, I think. Massimiliano Guido's Studies in Historical Improvisation, with lots of important articles. Then we have a whole series of these kind of publications. Many of these are edited by Armando Carideo. Here we have two edited by Eduardo Bellotti. And the series is so big, so I can't show them, all of them, but it's a very important series of publications on all kinds of improvisational matters and a lot of repertoire. Excellent series. Yeah, then we have my small contributions, the Counterpoint and Partimento book and the Sala edition that came out 2015 and 2017. A lovely book edited by Andrzej Zadejko, the Gronau improvisation treatise that is in Gdansk, I think. Am I right? Yes, in Gdansk. One of the most important sources for learning improvised fugue, these two volumes. Then we have Nicoleta Paraschivescu. She would have been here, but she is not. She got a problem with a tennis arm. But lovely book about Giovanni Paisiello's Partimenti, where she makes links between the different instrumental styles and the styles that are in these Partimenti. Very important publication. 2022 is this English translation. 2019 is the German version that came out in Switzerland. Then, the very important work by Rosa Cafiero. Actually, it's a whole team of scholars who have been working on the history of the Neapolitan conservatories according to Giuseppe Sigismondo. One volume in Italian and one volume with the English translation. If you don't know these books, go and get them. There is so much information in these books about Neapolitan traditions. And it's a pleasure to read, actually. It's You can read it as a summer lecture if you are bored with anything else. You can take those books. And then Rosa Cafiero's collected articles that came out only recently, La didattica del partimento. Yeah, this one I already mentioned, Compendium Improvisation, compiled by Marco Schwenkreis. A fantastic book to get ideas if you want to, if you are working with groups of students. There's a lot of material you can pick and collect and create. I use it a lot to create workshops and so on. It's a fantastic book. Then we have a few of them. These Brepels collected essays from conferences. Musical improvisation in the Baroque era. And now recently, last year, we had this book, Basso Continuo in Italy, Sources, Pedagogy and Performance, with lots of great articles. I can't mention all of them, but check out these volumes. Then, of course, the New Testament, child composers, how orphans became elite musicians. And then we have Nicholas Baragwanath's important work on solfeggio, which is so much related to Partimento studies. I had the privilege to work with Nick on this volume for music theory and analysis. We made a special issue about solfeggio in the 18th century with 5 or 6 articles in this issue. And this came out only this summer. In May, I think it came out. And then finally, I have a series in Sweden with a publisher with Partimento editions, here Cotomaci and Durant. Both of these were done this year. Then we have all the web-based stuff. This one I hope you know, all of you, partimenti.org, with so much valuable stuff which is available for free, and it's still growing, I think, if I'm correct. Yeah? That's fantastic. And then we have a lot of people who have been doing incredible work online through teaching and in festivals. Tobias Kram is one of the pioneers of this business, I would argue. He was very early on teaching Alma Deutscher and has developed a lot of skills in teaching young students to work with Partimenti, and it's a great pleasure to see him in action, to see him working with small Partimenti and singing and playing around. And then, of course, this. I think you all know this. The Art of Partimento, the Facebook group. Look, 6,100. Quite impressive. It is. Quite impressive for like a research topic. Not bad. And this was initiated or instigated by Marco Polacci, who just entered the room. Welcome, Marco. And Giorgio Sanguinetti. So this is a great forum to pose questions, and there's a fantastic generosity. People share their knowledge here. Very important, these websites and these networks. Then we have Nicol Hogan, who is not here, but who has done incredible work. I think he now has almost 200 episodes recorded with all kinds of people, not only Partimento-related stuff, but also philosophers and historians and jazz musicians and big band arrangers, but often with the topic incredible work. I think he now has almost 200 episodes recorded with all kinds of people, not only Partimento-related stuff, but also philosophers and historians and jazz musicians and big band arrangers, but often with the topic of playfulness in music. Yeah? Lots of great stuff there. I'm sure you know all this, but... And then we have some happy faces I wanted to share here. John's work is, of course, enormously important. He has this website, Improv Planet. You know, people come to Örebro and come to my courses, and then I ask them, how did you know that I was doing this? Oh, now I have been on the Improv Planet. Yeah? So people from the countryside in Sweden, they find John's website, and then they come to me after.
Well, we need to speak of an arrangement.
Very good. Yeah, here's another happy face. Simon Jakubowski. I think he's in Berlin and in Leipzig. Great improviser, and he's sharing his knowledge in a very generous way to many, many people. He has some improvisation sessions. And then Michal, is he still here? No, he was here earlier this week. If you don't know Michal Koch's YouTube channel, En Blanc et Noir, take a look at it, because it's among the best stuff that I've seen on Facebook. Really, really good. He's a great pianist, and he makes like 20-30 minute YouTube sessions about how to turn a valse by Chopin into a free improvisation. Yeah? And he has episodes on Schumann and on Rachmaninoff and Scriabin, all kinds of piano-related, very, very creative stuff. Yeah? So I really recommend you to check this out if you don't know it. Another happy face, Nicola Canzano. I think he would present something later today or maybe tomorrow. Tomorrow, yes. An exquisite musician, and he's doing so much valuable work in historical composition. When you hear his concerti grossi, you would swear they were by Corelli. Incredible. Yeah? Now this is my own. So, we have come to the last slide. This last slide is devoted to the question, where is this all going? And as I remarked at the very beginning of this lecture, I'm a historian, and it's not my job to speculate about the future, so this one is empty. But let me pose a few questions, at least, about the future. What kind of research would be needed in the coming 2 or 3 decades? I'm thinking about Partimento-related studies. Well, I mentioned a few things. There are still many questions about the rule of the octave. It would be fantastic if someone would conduct a real thorough investigation about the rule of the octave, or the regola della scala, as it was called in Italy. How it was linked to unfigured bass, where it does appear and where it does not appear, and also some chronology and so on. I think that would be very beneficial. Likewise, there are still many questions about the history of fundamental bass in 18th century Italy. Where was it used? By whom? Padua seems to have played an important role. What about the links between Paris and Padua? I know there are some smaller articles about this topic, but I'm waiting still on a thorough monography about this topic. That would be really exciting. Then we have the problem of the lack of knowledge about paper used in manuscript in Italy. Watermarks, rastra. There is one major study by Stefan Chiron on the Neapolitan composer Nicola Fago, a huge dissertation of more than 1,100 pages. But just imagine the type of detail we would get if the manuscripts on solfeggio, partimento, and counterpoint would be photographed with ultraviolet, as they have been doing in the Deutsche Bücherei in Leipzig for German sources. If we would get that for Naples and for Bologna, that would mean a lot, I think. And then we have finally the benefits for today's application. I think as we learn more about the details of the pedagogy, the interrelatedness of solfeggio, partimento, and written counterpoint, the benefits of seeing these together and figuring out how it worked together would also mean a lot. Okay, lots of questions here. Having come to the end of this talk, I have just one last question that I will answer myself. So having come to the conclusion that this whole new world of partimento or partimenti, with its websites, its digital editions, Facebook groups and YouTube channels, and all other new forms of communications are actually up there in cloud functions. That is to say, in our new digital heaven. I would like to rephrase Augusta's question. Does partimento come from heaven nowadays? It does, folks. It does. Schönen Dank.
Thank you, Peter. I'm sure there will be many questions for you. Before opening the space for questions, I would like to add that we have currently ongoing in Italy a project on improvisation, believe it or not, financed by the Italian government. And the final stage of this project, in the middle, John came a month ago, I think, in Rome and Casino, and we had a huge, fantastic workshop on improvisation with Costantino Mastropimiano, forte pianist, myself, and John. And the last stage of this project will be on December, from 4 to 6 December in Siena at the Accademia Musicale Chigiana, a conference, and I'm sure that a volume of Chigiana will be published with the proceeding of this conference. So this is something probably that you didn't know, and I invite all of you to come to wonderful Siena and to attend to this conference, 4 to 6 December. Okay, there are questions?
Okay, then we go on to the next one.
Peter, thank you for this wonderful talk. We've discussed your courses that you're now offering, and I just had lunch with my former student, Deborah, who's teaching at a fairly early level and is looking at partimento methods to help these students be engaged. I know many, many teachers who are working with amateurs and children. Can you comment on the level that you're getting in your courses and the way that you approach people who are at, let's say, earlier stages of learning, the type of materials and strategies you use to help them make music? Thank you.
Yeah, so I have been using Durante for the past 10 years or so. I started with just paper transcriptions, but now I have the edition, and I think Durante is, for me, it fits very well the way I like to teach, since Durante has these repeated cadences, like 3 notes, and then you do it like 7 times in different keys, and as I understood from the counterpoint notebooks, every time you do a new key, you enter a little variation. So that you see in Durante's approach from the first page, and I think for me this has been a revelation to see how quickly students get the idea that, aha, can I use what I just did? Okay, so 2 of the 3 voices are identical but in a new key. Great, then I don't have to listen to all of them. I can just listen to one voice. So this notion that, okay, the variation is where? Top voice, middle voice, or bass? Oh, it's in the middle voice. Great, then just sing it. And then they sing it. And then they find it on the keyboard and they put it together. Yeah? And I combine that in my digital teaching with a hat cam, so they can get some visual support of how the fingers are moving. Because that's often the thing they find difficult in the beginning. So if the thumb has to go under or whatever. So I use Durante, and I go through the first part of Durante, and then I jump into Mattei, yeah. And I record different versions. So I send them recordings, and they imitate them first, and then they discover that, we've done this pattern before. So they learn, well, then I can do it like this too, here. So it gets connected. There's so much, it's full of cliches, these 100, and they recognize the cliches. So you don't need to say so much. You can just play and send them. And then they send me realizations. I have a few that I haven't listened to yet. They put small sound files in Messenger. So every morning when I wake up, I open my computer and I start these files, and my wife screams, "Not now, I'm still sleeping." That's how it goes. Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. This quotation of Marx, I was just thinking about, of course, it's a misconception of basso continuo that's behind his problems with it. Would you dare to reflect a little bit now also to our misconception of partimento that perhaps we have today?
Yes. So for me, partimento, it's a matter of efficiency. I use partimento to save time because I have so little time with my students, and I just noticed that if I work with partimento-based methods with pre-recorded stuff that I can send to them over a learning platform, I notice that they progress so much faster. Yeah? So I don't use it for if they want to become a composer. I would not use partimento for that. Maybe in tonal music if they want to write in historical styles, But if they want to find like a personal expression or a personal musical style, I think it would be better perhaps to study Stravinsky or other more modern composers. So I use it where I think it does best, benefits the most. But misconceptions, I don't think I don't have a clear answer to that. I think the knowledge about Partimento is growing all the time, and I see it as a very good thing that we are starting to understand the links between solfeggio and Partimento, and also between Partimento and written counterpoint. That there is an institutional context that is important for understanding the reading of these pieces. So that's possibly a thing that I think will develop further, that we will understand what is demanded of me. Can I understand it without looking at the context? Because they say so little, they explain so little, so we really need to look at the educational context. Who was the teacher? Who was the teacher of the teacher? What are they really doing? What is the construction of the curriculum? And what steps are they taking, and what methods are they taking to reach those steps? All these things matter for appropriately or correctly reading the pieces and to understand what you should do with them. So I think this knowledge is gradually growing and growing and growing. You see that in Facebook clips and YouTube clips, that this knowledge is gradually rising. So I think we are on the right track. But there may be more people who could answer this question.
Yeah, Peter, thank you for the presentation. I've seen already a couple of presentations by you, and I must say that this one is quite different from what you normally do, where you delve into the very specific counterpoint in the manuscript. I would like to have your opinion on something I've been struggling with since a while. We tend to see Partimento as a pedagogical tool, as a kind of intermediate state from early beginning of musicianship to what you then see on Facebook, these brilliant improvisations by very gifted people. But I have organized a couple of, well, let's say Partimento concerts. How do you think about that? How do you think about seeing Partimento as also as a kind of end goal of something that can be artistically presented to an audience? Because that's something that, as far as I'm aware, on Facebook and other channels, does not happen a lot. There are a couple of videos by, for instance, Ewald de Meijer, where he explains what he does, but still it stays a bit in this realm of it's not a real thing. So how could that be another layer or another way to go to even revive more the practice of Partimento playing?
I think it sounds fun.
It is fun.
Yeah. No, but I think it's perfectly all right to do whatever you want with Partimenti in how you want to use it. Feel free to do what you want. I think as a historian, when I look at how Partimento was used in the Neapolitan conservatories, I see a very strong link between the method of working in Partimento and in counterpoint. And I think Partimento was a tool as a preliminary stage for, just because the methodology of working was so linked in these both schools. You know, what the Leo school does in Partimento, they do in contrapuntal teaching, and in the same way, what they do in Partimento, they do in the contrapunto, in the written counterpoint. So it's a very strong link. So historically, I would say, yeah, the Partimento is a tool for these boys to reach a certain level, to pass the exam, to get into the composition class. But don't let it stop you to do what you want.
Hello. How are you, Peter? Thank you. My question is sort of about solfeggio. I think you are the first presenter who's mentioned it so far. Of course, we know that solfeggio was the first thing that people studied, and in many of the presentations, people have also mentioned the difficulty or something about how melody is quite difficult to communicate and study. And Parlamento is clearly more accessible right away than studying, the massive numbers of solfeggi pieces that they probably would have done. But, I'm curious, you've done, something about the solfeggi, and I wonder how that's affected the way that you teach Parlamenti or vice versa. Generally, where does solfeggi fit into the whole modern movement we have here?
Yeah, good question. So I see solfeggio as the materials for the singing lessons. So the subject, if we would think of what's the subject, I would say the subject is canto. And what would they put on the note stand? It would be solfeggi. In the same way, I would say in accompaniment and figured bass, I would say the subject would be contrapunto pratico. And the materials of them was in two stages. First, partimenti, you're playing it, and then an exam, and then you do written counterpoint. So that's one thing. The other thing is that there is a stronger connection, in my opinion, between partimento and written counterpoint than there is a connection between solfeggio and partimenti. If you look at Durante's strategies in partimento and in written counterpoint are very strongly linked. He uses the same pieces in the basis of it's the same strategy of always working over the bass and never under the bass. And it's the same in the Leo school. If you start to work with partimenti in the Leo school, it was double counterpoint related from the very beginning, and it stays that way also when you start to do written counterpoint. Now, what about the solfeggi? If you look at the Durante solfeggi, they're quite old-fashioned. It's more like church music pieces. So why are the solfeggi old-fashioned while he was so modern in his partimento and in his counterpoint teaching? I think the reason is that it was a complement to what he did in partimento and so you learned to sing. You went to the singing teacher and you had to get a good voice and learn intonation and breathing and vocal technique and everything. And what was missing from the partimento and the counterpoint curriculum, you could do with the singing. And it's the same with Leo. If you look at the Leo solfeggi, there are hundreds and hundreds of like opera-style arias, aria-type solfeggi. They look more modern than those by Durante. Durante's pieces are much more old-fashioned in how they look. So Leo was super conservative in his partimenti, so lots of like alla breve whole notes and half notes and lots of suspensions and church music style, lots of double counterpoint. And it's leading to fugues, 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 fugues. 2, 3 part, 4 part with text and with orchestra and then part of a Dixit, part of a mass. It's all fugues, 4 years long. They hardly do anything else. So what do they do in the solfeggio to complement that? Of course, the aria stuff from the operas. So there is a strong link between partimento counterpoint and the solfeggio are a complement, I think, to make the education more complete. That's my take on it.
Thank you, Peter. I think that it's time for coffee break, maybe. And thank you for your wonderful presentation. And
Thank you, Joseph.
see you next time.
So I think it's time to start with the next session. I'm very delighted to open this part that it will be about non-keyboard instruments, as so far the most papers have been about keyboard instruments. It was wonderful, but I think it's also interesting to see other sides of Partimenti. So I will present now the first speaker, Robert Debré, who is an oboist, recorder player, improviser. So you can imagine that it will be about the use of Partimento, a melodic instrument, as is an oboe and recorder player, and he's also a scholar in Partimento. He's played in several very renowned baroque concerts like English Baroque Soloist, Ensemble Pygmalion, L'Arpeggiata. And yeah, it will show us exactly what you can do in this case when you don't have a keyboard instrument. So I'm really looking forward to your speech.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation and for the fantastic organization and the wonderful people and the wonderful students that are here that came to the workshops. They're all the best. So indeed, I will talk about partimento when you don't play a keyboard instrument. I will have the help of Jason. Oh yeah, he's there. So sometimes it is helpful to use a keyboard instrument, but just that you don't play it yourself. I used to love playing the keyboard. Actually, my sister is a fantastic piano player. But I asked my parents if I could also play the piano, but I was already playing clarinet and recorder, so I wasn't allowed to play the piano as well. So whenever my family wasn't at home, I would secretly go to the piano and try to kind of play like a little bit like what my sister was playing, and that's how I started to improvise. But still, my skills on the piano are not good enough to really reap the fantastic benefits of partimento. So I started thinking what would be possible for me and my friends, so many in the world, to be able to play and get some positive results from using partimento. So first I will talk a little bit about that, partimento on melodic instruments, and then I will show two ways of translating partimento onto a melodic instrument. One of them would be with a bass, where Jason will feature as well, and the other would be a solo without a bass. And on we go. Oh, somehow I spilled some nice soup on my computer. So first the question, partimento on melodic instruments, yay or nay? I personally think probably not really, but there are some buts. First of all, of course, Giovanna, who's going to do a fantastic presentation after me, has found many interesting sources that on bass instruments, specifically the cello and gamba, I think they work very well and it's very convincing. But for us on the top, there is not really a piece that is called partimento, and there's also not really this idea of having a bass line and then can the recorder play the rest. Or the oboe or whatever. But if we look a little bit further, we have some hints that this idea of partimento did live in our world as well. So first of all, if we look at Quantz's Versuch, he actually teaches ornamentation using partimento building blocks. We'll look at that soon. Also Autoterre l'art de préluder. And also, for example, the division violin or flute. This is a book in which basically there are these grounds and they have variations to show amateur musicians, especially based in London, how could you improvise on these basses. And these bass lines are all very typical tetrachord, descending. There's even a rule of the octave there. There are all kinds of very typical bass motions that we use in partimento. It's just not called that. And I guess it slightly predates that as well. So that's interesting as well. Then an interesting little hint, but it's a little bit presumptuous, is in Mr. Nied's Musikalische Handleitung. When he talks about the prelude, he says that anyone on any instrument could prelude. And then later when he explains how you would improvise a prelude, he gives a bass and then you would improvise over the bass. So you could imagine that this would be the way that a melodic instrument would improvise a prelude. But it's, I mean, obviously he doesn't actually say that, so that's just a link that I made myself. Then if we look in the next century, it's very interesting. In Mr. Panseron's L'art de moduler au violon, he has this fantastic phrase where he says, well, this whole book, it's just to give you a simple approach to preluding, modulating, and even improvising. To me, that would mean also that, so you can learn to prelude. Also other methods talk about preluding, cadenzas, ornamenting, but then they specifically mention the word improvisation separately. They don't say what that actually means, but this could be something either on a partimento or more harmonically driven, which they do not teach, perhaps because that was only up for the professional musicians. Panseron, on top of that, also gives us some examples of the rule of the octave, some preludes that are clearly based also on these kind of moves, the moti del basso. So clearly in our melodic world, the influences are there. Of course, there's also our repertoire, which is filled with examples of how you could realize a partimento. And so when you take them and make your own catalog, you can make your own kind of partimento school. Finally, in the 19th century, several instrumental methods also have just this little half page where they say, oh, this is how you accompany a scale. It doesn't explain at all why you would need this information. It's in bassoon methods, clarinet methods, and even in a method for serpent, which is this very old kind of, you could call it a sort of proto-tuba, but it's not that at all. But you can look it up. It's a very cool instrument, especially look up Michel Godard. Okay, but onwards, basically my conclusion is there isn't really a real partimento for my type of instrument, but that doesn't mean that we can't actually do something with it. I think the first of all, it's interesting to play with a bass, because then you can make the connection with the harmonic structure that's behind it, and you can make this aural picture, which then if you kick out the bass player, you can then you have an image to go from to make your own senza basso realizations. So first of all, I wanted to have a quick look at quants. I presume you are familiar with this book. It's an incredibly famous book, of course, also already in that time translated in many languages. It's a flute method from the 18th century, but only 5-6 chapters really deal only with the flute, and all the other chapters talk about what is an allegro, what is how do you ornament, how are you a good ripieno player in the orchestra. So all kinds of basic information that is super useful for us, well, for anyone who is interested in the 18th century, and therefore, I guess, also partimento. Today, specifically, what is interesting is the way he teaches ornamentation. So, interestingly, he actually says, I want to teach you ornamentation in case you don't know harmony. So if you know harmony or partimento, then you don't need this information. But if you don't, I'll give you a method how you could still ornament without having this knowledge. And what he then does, he gives these the figuren, these little basic building blocks, and you probably already recognized several ideas, like we have a basic cadence, we have a bit of the rule of the octave, we have this 4-2 idea, half step up, of course, also very important. We have the 7-6, we have 5-6 here. So we have several basic partimento building blocks that he talks about. And then he shows, well, this is my version of that. Then he shows this melody for 7-6ing, for instance. Then he shows all kinds of ornaments that you can use on that. I've organized them here myself. But, well, there it's on IMSLP, you can have a look. So for each of those building blocks, he gives at least 5, sometimes up to 15 different ornaments, which is really great. And so now Jason will help me. We have a little bit of a baseline here, and I will use some of Quantz's ideas to ornament this piece. But of course, also, because he shows this basic building block in the bass, I also know what would be the basic melody that I should use. So both ways that works. The bass is a bass line from Mr. Neat, which we'll look at after. I thought it was interesting. If you know the book, the Musikalische Handleitung by Neat, there's a very beautiful bass that he uses to make different dance forms. We'll look at that as well, which is a really nice bass, but I wanted to do the other bass. I'm not too happy about my choice, but the other bass is nicer, I think. But nevertheless, it will show the idea. Yes. So this would be a way to take a melodic line, be inspired also by Quantz's basic melodic lines and ornament them, and you can play with that for several years, in fact. Then, of course, that's just the one line. If you play this on a keyboard instrument, you would probably at least have 2 other voices. I guess not more, that's not allowed. But in any case, two more voices. Then we can look at Mr. Matteson's Volkommene Kapellmeister, and after he explained how counterpoint works and how you could, how that works, he shows another chapter where he says, well, you might not always have a keyboard instrument or all the instruments to fulfill all the parts that you want to either contrapuntalize or even if it's written music. And in that case, you could just play both parts in one melody. So here he shows how this 2-part structure could be played in one melodic line. But he says you could also do that with a bass that is being played. Well, and then he says basically all the options are endless. You could even do that in some cases on the voice, he says. So then we go back to Mr. Need. So it's a little bit of a whirlwind of going from book to book. And Mr. Need does something similar. But in this case, he shows a particular figuration. So if we have a 6, these would be the 2 main notes you would use. And this is how you could melodically play those. So this is another approach. I think even Need's own example is a little bit funny, but so I will try to emulate a little bit this style. Hopefully it will also feel different from the Quantz, because then you can see how there's all these different ways of doing that, even on our melodic instruments. Yes, I think that's clear. So I'm using the models that he proposes for all the different building blocks. The same little piece. So that's Mr. Need. I have this daunting feeling like I'm forgetting something completely, but it's probably just left on the fire at home, so don't worry. So then, of course, one of our most important inspirations in the 18th century is Mr. Corelli, Arcangelo. He published an exceptional collection, Opus 5, but also the trio sonatas. Of course, they're also a big influence on, well, everything that happened in the 18th century, more or less. And so if we look at the first 6 sonatas, which are in this form with allegros, adagios, there are 2 forms that I would like to talk about. First of all, the allegro is interestingly very consistent. All these allegros, unless they are fugal, which I will not talk about because I think that is a different type, different approach. Most of them have this constant rhythmic motion, often 16ths, but also sometimes 8th notes. And interestingly, also the dissonances are not always expressed in the violin line. And this is something that when I was starting with Partimento, I was really obsessed with getting all the 4s and 7s and 9s in. It was interesting for me to see that Corelli himself doesn't always do that, even though it's in the line. And it could be maybe also because very possibly the accompaniment was done on the cello, and so a lot of dissonances, it would be very interesting to kind of interact with the cellist, who would sometimes take the dissonances and sometimes he would take the dissonance on the violin, and this I think could be a very interesting texture. Maybe next symposium we can experiment with that, Giovanna. And then it's also very interesting that very often the motivic material will be very varied. So if we have one of the ideas in the improvisation world is kind of prelude, where you have the same the same kind of motion all the time through. It's something that Corelli basically doesn't do. So I think it's very interesting and also very hard, but well, I just need to practice more. But I will still try to do it. Here's an example. Here you can see this is there's not even a ta-da-ta-tam or anything. There's no stop. It just keeps on going all the time, all the time, all the time. Just to maybe preempt the remark that, well, this is for the violin, so it should not apply to the recorder, that you should make stops to breathe. But of course, these pieces were all arranged for the recorder in the 18th century with no added stops. So, and we also have, for instance, the Flute Allemande by Bach, which is also basically just keep on going. So, an interesting challenge in any case. So here are some examples of dissonances not being expressed. Here we have a typical 7/6, where actually the violin line just does the sort of faux bourdon thing of 3rd and 6th. And then here you could argue that maybe for a little moment maybe there's something here, but not. But that's too late. Of course, the 7 was already here. Then here are some examples of cadences where Corelli stays on the 5 basically and doesn't express this 4. Here's a beautiful 9, but he doesn't do that either, etc., etc. Of course, there are moments he does express the dissonances, but it was just interesting for me. For instance, in this sequence, just every time there's a dissonance, it's not there in the violin part. So now I shall attempt to do this myself. I chose hopefully easy Partimento, so I can manage. Well, still some work to be done, but next time, better luck. So then we also have a typical slow movement, the adagio. I use this allegro and adagio. It's also what Quantz says. Any slow movement he calls an adagio, and any fast movement he calls an allegro. We find here some note against note counterpoint most of the time. Sometimes there's also long notes over a bass, which is always nice if you're doing a partimento, that you can have some rests. Again, not all figures are expressed in the melody, and ornamentation connects some simple counterpoint. Here's some example of some nice long notes. Also interesting, he uses the same melodic ideas when the same bass comes back. And here are some examples of ornamentation. It's probably well known to most of you how that works, connecting some notes, but some also stay unornamented. So I shall try that on this piece. Then we could also do something with some dance movements. So now we're back to Mr. Neat, but also the second section of Corelli's sonatas are all in the shape of the Sonata da Chiesa, which has these dance movements. We could take a partimento and make that into an allemande. Of course, an allemande needs a repeat of the first section, and then when we've made it to the dominant or some other nice key, and then we can come back. Then for a sarabande, I've taken this part of the partimento only and put the first bit in E minor as well to have a nice sarabande in minor, and used this nice bit twice because I liked it very much. Oh yeah, and we will have also one of my favorite chords here, the sharp 579, very typical in French music. All right. Then we could also do this without a bass, and I shall keep on running. So we have some very early examples also, which we saw from Augusta, of course, of music for a melodic instrument without a bass. For example, the Bassano Ricercates from 1585. We already see some interesting ideas where different voices are played. We could also look at Mr. van Eyck, Der Fluiten Lusthof, where he also already uses some partimento ideas, and there's some fantasias, preludes for recorder solo. I will skip that for now because it's less relevant. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about L'Art de Préluder. It's our most important improvisation book in the 18th century. Initially, I saw it mostly as really a melodic method where we can learn how to improvise according to a canva, a skeleton which we fill in melodically. Usually the skeleton is a scale or a triad, and that's it. So not very partimento-esque. But then if we look further on, especially in the elements of the tret, we see some very interesting ideas. So the 5 down, 4 up. Also for recorder players this and flute players, this one will be very recognizable. So very beautiful chromatic descent. Telemann uses it in his second fantasia in the Vivace. We have these beautiful parallel 6 with a tenor cadence, do re mi. We can find this, etc., etc. And I wanted to and then there's this very strange thing where we have, it just says arpège or arpégé, I guess. So the top one is pretty nice. I will just play the first one. Sorry, French clef, of course. Hello. So that's basically a normal rule of the octave. But then if we look at this one, it's basically parallel fifths all the way through. So yeah, very interesting. So there is a hint towards the rule of the octave, but then also a very strange, I guess, very melodic interpretation of that. Then Otto Ter talks about the trait, and he says it's the name to some fragments which can be found in that chapter. My intention has been to characterize them in the manner of caprice produced when one is, so to speak, just playing around on the instrument. So then a next step for us could be, okay, we have learned some of these partimento models. Can we now improvise a sort of caprice inspired by these ideas just freely? So I'll try to do that now. And finally, we have my work on Telemann Fantasias as an inspiration to play partimenti on a single instrument. Inspiration, as always, can be found with Mr. Matteson. Here he shows us 3 parts that could be played on one melody instrument. You can find the reference here. Feel free to ask me also, or maybe that's a standard practice. You can have all the presentation if you want to look back at all these ideas. Here we have this thing that I showed you also in the Haute Terre, in Telemann's Flute Fantasia. With a little nice